Thunder cracked across the leaden sky as Thomas Zimmerman squinted through the sheets of rain hammering down on the Texas plains. It was 1875, and the worst spring storm in years had transformed the dusty trails around Dalhart into treacherous rivers of mud. The lone cowboy hunched lower in his saddle, his drenched coat providing little protection against the deluge. Most men would have sought shelter hours ago, but the desperate message he'd received at the Broken Spoke saloon had sent him riding headlong into the tempest. "There's a woman and her young one stranded at the old Whitaker place," the stagecoach driver had gasped, stumbling into the saloon soaked to the bone. "Roofs half gone, creeks rising fast. Nobody's fool enough to ride out there now." Thomas had simply downed his whiskey, thrown a silver dollar on the counter, and headed for the stables without a word. That had been 2 hours ago. Now, as lightning illuminated the flooded landscape, he questioned his own sanity. The Whitaker homestead lay another mile ahead, separated from town by a creek that would now be a raging torrent. His gelding, Bandit, snorted and fought against the reins as another flash of lightning split the sky. Thomas leaned forward, patting the animal's soaked neck. "Just a bit further, boy," he murmured, though his words were swallowed by the howling wind. Thomas had been drifting through Texas for 3 years, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. A former Union cavalry officer turned cowhand, he carried the weight of the war and personal tragedy on his shoulders. At 32, the hard lines of his face and the permanent furrow between his brows told the story of a man who had seen too much. The dim outline of the Whitaker place appeared through the downpour, a small homestead abandoned last winter when old man Whitaker finally succumbed to pneumonia. Thomas couldn't imagine why anyone would be out here, especially a woman and child. As he approached, he spotted a wagon with a broken wheel tilted into a ditch beside the house. He dismounted in the mud, securing Bandit to a post beneath the remnants of the porch roof. Water streamed through gaping holes above, creating small waterfalls onto the weathered boards. The door hung at an angle, creaking in the wind. "Hello," he called, pushing the door open. "Anybody here?" A feeble light flickered from within. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, Thomas saw a woman huddled in the corner of the dilapidated cabin, clutching a small child to her chest. A nearly spent candle provided the only light. "Oh, thank God," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I thought no one would come." Thomas removed his hat, water cascading from the brim. "Madam," he nodded, assessing the situation quickly. The roof was indeed partially collapsed, with water pouring in and pooling on the wooden floor. The woman was shivering violently, her dress soaked. The child, a girl of about 5 or 6, was wrapped in what appeared to be the woman's shawl. "My wagon broke down," she explained, her teeth chattering. "We were trying to reach Dalhart when the storm hit. My daughter is burning with fever." Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside them. The child's face was flushed, her breathing labored. "I'm Thomas Zimmerman," he said, removing his wet coat. "We need to get you both to town. This place isn't safe." "Bethany Blackburn," she replied, her blue eyes reflecting the candlelight. "And this is my daughter, Sarah." Thomas frowned at the child's condition. "How long has she been ill?" 3 days now. We were headed to Dalhart to see the doctor, my husband." Her voice faltered. "He passed last month. Fever took him too. We couldn't stay at our place anymore." The roof groaned ominously above them as another torrent of rain pounded the weakened structure. Thomas glanced up, noting the sagging beams. "We can't stay here, Mrs. Blackburn. The creek between here and town is rising. If we wait much longer, we won't be able to cross." Beth clutched her daughter tighter. "I don't know if Sarah can handle the journey in this weather." A tremendous crash shook the cabin as part of the roof gave way at the far end. Thomas made his decision instantly. We don't have a choice. Grab whatever you need. We're leaving now. Outside, the storm had intensified. Thomas helped Beth and Sarah onto Bandit, then gathered what few belongings they had brought from the wagon. The child was barely conscious, whimpering softly against her mother's chest. "Hold on tight," he instructed Beth as he swung up behind them. "I know a place we can shelter until it's safe to cross the creek." They rode through the howling darkness, Thomas guiding Bandit carefully over the treacherous ground. Beth clung to the saddle horn with one hand while holding Sarah securely with the other. Thomas found himself unconsciously supporting Beth with his arm around her waist, feeling her trembling against him. After 20 minutes of slow progress, they reached the old line shack Thomas had remembered, a sturdy little structure used by cowhands during roundups. It sat on higher ground, safe from the rising waters. "It's not much," he said as they dismounted under the small overhang, "but it's dry." Inside, the single room was bare except for a small iron stove, a rough wooden table, and a couple of cots. Thomas quickly got a fire going in the stove while Beth tended to Sarah, laying her on one of the cots. "She's burning up," Beth said, her voice tight with worry as she pressed a hand to her daughter's forehead. Thomas rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a small pouch. "Creek willow bark," he explained. "Makes a tea that helps with fever. Not as good as a doctor's medicine, but it might help until we can get to town." While the water boiled, Thomas hung their wet clothes near the stove and laid out the few dry blankets he found in a trunk. Beth sat beside her daughter, gently stroking her hair. In the warm glow of the stove light, Thomas noticed the deep circles under Beth's eyes and the worry etched across her face. "You've been traveling long?" he asked, preparing the willow bark tea. Beth nodded wearily. 3 days from our homestead near Amarillo, after James died. There was nothing left for us there." She accepted the cup he offered, carefully helping Sarah sip the bitter liquid. "What about you, Mr. Zimmerman? You don't seem like most cowboys passing through." Thomas sat across from them, his expression guarded. "I go where work takes me. Been with the Rockingham Ranch outside Dalhart for a few months. You risked your life riding out in this storm for strangers," Beth observed quietly. "That says something about the kind of man you are." Thomas shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Any decent man would have done the same. "No," Beth said with certainty. "They wouldn't have." Outside, the storm raged through the night. Thomas kept the fire burning, checking periodically on Bandit, who was sheltered under the lean-to attached to the shack. Beth eventually dozed off beside her daughter, one hand protectively resting on the child's chest. Thomas watched them sleep, struck by an unfamiliar feeling in his chest. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to care about anyone. After losing his wife and infant son to influenza during the war, he'd built walls around his heart, drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments. Yet something about this woman's quiet strength and the vulnerable child stirred something he thought long dead. By morning, the rain had subsided to a gentle patter. Sarah's fever had broken during the night, and she was now sleeping peacefully. Beth awoke to find Thomas at the stove, cooking a simple breakfast from supplies in his saddlebags. "How is she?" he asked, nodding toward Sarah. Beth felt her daughter's forehead, relief flooding her features. "Better. The fever's down. Your tea helped." "Creek's still high," Thomas said, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "We should wait a few more hours before attempting to cross." Beth accepted the cup gratefully, their fingers brushing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Thomas nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Just happened to be at the right place. Or perhaps it was Providence," Beth suggested. I prayed for help yesterday when the wagon broke down, and then you appeared like an answer." Thomas turned away, checking his saddle by the door. "I don't put much stock in such things anymore, Mrs. Blackburn." "Beth," she corrected him. "Please call me Beth." She studied him thoughtfully. "You've known loss, haven't you? I recognize it. It's like looking in a mirror sometimes." Thomas stiffened but didn't respond. Sarah stirred on the cot, saving him from having to answer. "Mama." The child called weakly. Beth was immediately at her side. "I'm here, sweetheart." Sarah's eyes, the same vivid blue as her mother's, focused on Thomas. "Who's that man?" "That's Mr. Zimmerman," Beth explained. "He helped us during the storm." Sarah regarded him solemnly. "Are you an angel?" Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. "No, little one, just a cowboy." "But Mama said God would send an angel to help us," Sarah insisted. "And you came." Beth smoothed her daughter's tangled blonde hair. "Sometimes, Sarah, God's angels don't have wings. They wear cowboy hats and ride horses." Thomas busied himself preparing to leave, uncomfortable with their conversation. By midday, the rain had stopped completely, though gray clouds still hung low in the sky. The creek had receded enough that Thomas deemed it safe to cross. They rode into Dalhart late that afternoon, drawing curious stares from townspeople who had emerged to assess storm damage. Thomas took them directly to Dr. Wallace's office, carrying Sarah from the horse when the child was too tired to walk. The doctor, a graying man with kind eyes, examined Sarah thoroughly. "The fever's passing, but she's got a chest cold that could turn to pneumonia if not treated. You did right bringing her in," he told Beth. He glanced at Thomas, noting his wet clothes and exhausted appearance. "Heard the creek was impassable last night. Must have been quite a ride." Word spread quickly through the small town the cowboy who'd ridden through a raging storm to save a stranded mother and child. By evening, when Thomas escorted Beth and Sarah to the boarding house run by widow Clara Jenkins, several townspeople stopped him to shake his hand. "You're something of a local hero," Beth commented as they stood on the boarding house porch. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "People talk too much in small towns." "Will you come check on us tomorrow?" Beth asked hesitantly. Thomas nodded, surprised by his own eagerness to say yes. "I'll come by after my shift at the ranch." Over the next 2 weeks, as Sarah recovered her strength, Thomas found himself drawn to the boarding house daily. At first, he told himself it was just to check on the child's recovery, but soon he was spending his evenings in the parlor, listening to Beth read stories to Sarah, or simply talking with Beth after Sarah had gone to bed. Beth had been a schoolteacher before marrying James Blackburn, a wheat farmer with dreams bigger than his means. She spoke of books and ideas with a passion that Thomas found captivating. Unlike many women he'd known, she wasn't afraid to disagree with him or challenge his views. "You should settle somewhere," she told him one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. Sarah was asleep upstairs, and the spring night was mild and fragrant with blooming wildflowers. "A man needs roots." "Never found a place worth putting them down," Thomas replied, though the words felt hollow as he spoke them. Beth studied him thoughtfully. "What happened to her?" "Who?" Thomas asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "The woman you lost." "I see it in your eyes sometimes when you think no one's watching." Thomas stared into the darkness for a long moment. "Her name was Emma," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "And our son was William. Influenza took them both while I was fighting with the Union cavalry." I came home to fresh graves and an empty house. Beth reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. "I'm sorry, Thomas." Her touch sent warmth through him, both comforting and unsettling. "It was a long time ago. Time doesn't heal all wounds," she said softly. "It just teaches us to live with them." In her words, Thomas recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss not as an abstract concept, but as a daily companion. Yet, unlike him, Beth had found the strength to keep her heart open. As April turned to May, the prairie exploded in wildflowers. Thomas took Beth and Sarah riding on his days off, showing them the beauty of the Texas Panhandle landscapes. Sarah, fully recovered and bursting with energy, collected wildflowers while Thomas taught her to identify animal tracks. "She adores you," Beth remarked one afternoon as they watched Sarah chasing butterflies in a meadow. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "She's a special child, smart as a whip like her mother." Beth colored slightly at the compliment. "She needs a father figure. I worry about raising her alone." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but palpable. Thomas felt a mix of longing and fear twist inside him. He had avoided attachments for so long that the prospect both attracted and terrified him. Their quiet moment was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats. Frank Miller, the foreman from the Rocking M, rode up with a concerned expression. "Zimmerman, we've got trouble. Cattle rustlers hit the north pasture last night. Boss wants all hands." Thomas nodded grimly. "I'll be right there." He turned to Beth. "I need to go." "Of course," she said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Be careful." The rustlers proved more dangerous than anticipated. A band of 6 desperate men had been working their way through the Texas Panhandle, stealing cattle and leaving violence in their wake. For 3 days, Thomas and the other ranch hands tracked them, finally cornering the gang in a narrow canyon. The ensuing gunfight left 2 rustlers dead and another wounded. Thomas took a bullet to his left shoulder, though he managed to stay in the saddle until they'd rounded up the stolen cattle and delivered the captured rustlers to the sheriff in Dalhart. "You need a doctor," the sheriff insisted, noting Thomas's blood-soaked shirt. "After I check on someone," Thomas replied stubbornly, heading toward the boarding house. Beth gasped when she opened the door to find Thomas pale and bloodied on her doorstep. "My God, what happened?" "Nothing serious," he assured her as she helped him to a chair. "Bullet went clean through. Just wanted to make sure you and Sarah were all right. You're bleeding all over Mrs. Jenkins's floor and you're worried about us." Beth scolded, though her hands were gentle as she helped remove his coat. "Doctor." Wallace was summoned, and after cleaning and bandaging the wound, he ordered Thomas to rest. "No riding for at least a week," he insisted. With no family in town and his quarters at the ranch bunkhouse unsuitable for recovery, Thomas found himself installed in the boarding house's spare room at Beth's insistence. Mrs. Jenkins, who had come to regard Beth and Sarah as family, readily agreed. "The town's calling it a miracle, you know," Mrs. Jenkins told Thomas as she brought him dinner on his second day of convalescence. "How you rode through that terrible storm to save Mrs. Blackburn and little Sarah. Pastor Wilkins mentioned it in his sermon last Sunday." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "People are making too much of it." Mrs. Jenkins smiled knowingly. "Perhaps, or perhaps the Almighty had a hand in bringing you 3 together." During his recovery, Thomas found himself spending more time with Sarah, telling her stories of his travels while Beth worked at the dressmaker's shop where she'd found employment. The child's bright curiosity reminded him painfully of the son he'd never had the chance to know. Yet there was healing in her innocent questions and ready laughter. When Beth returned from work each evening, the 3 would share dinner, creating a semblance of family that Thomas had convinced himself he would never have again. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying. "You're good with her," Beth observed one evening after Sarah had fallen asleep with her head in Thomas's lap as he rade to her. Thomas gently stroked the sleeping child's hair. "She makes it easy. Have you thought about what you'll do when you're healed? Beth asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Will you stay at the Rockingham? Thomas was silent for a long moment. I've been offered a job as deputy sheriff, he finally said. Sheriff Morgan approached me yesterday. Said they need someone who can handle himself after what happened with the rustlers. Beth's face brightened. That would mean you'd be staying in Dalhart. I'm considering it, Thomas admitted. The truth was, for the first time in years, the idea of putting down roots appealed to him. But fear still gnawed at his heart, fear of caring too deeply, of losing again. That night, as Thomas lay awake in his room, a soft knock came at his door. Beth stood in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her nightdress. I couldn't sleep, she explained softly. May I come in? Thomas nodded, sitting up in bed, suddenly conscious of his state of undress. Beth sat on the edge of his bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I need to know something, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you staying because of us? Because if you are, I need to know what that means. In the dim lamplight, her blue eyes searched his face. Thomas reached out, taking her hands in his. I haven't stayed anywhere for years, he admitted, but when I think of leaving now, it feels wrong. You and Sarah, you've woken something in me I thought was dead. Beth's eyes filled with tears. I never expected to feel this way again after James died. It frightens me how much I've come to depend on seeing you each day. Thomas brushed a tear from her cheek. Beth, I can't promise I won't carry the past with me. There are shadows I may never fully escape. I'm not asking you to forget, she said, only to make room in your heart for something new. Their first kiss was tentative, gentle, the hesitant beginning of something neither had sought but both had found. When Beth returned to her room that night, something fundamental had shifted between them. In the weeks that followed, as spring surrendered to summer, Thomas accepted the deputy position and began looking for a small house to rent. The town watched with approving eyes as the unlikely family formed the drifter Cowboy who'd ridden through a storm, the widowed mother, and the child who believed him an angel. Not everyone approved, of course. James Blackburn's brother arrived from Amarillo, insisting that Beth and Sarah should return with him to the family farm. It's not proper, Beth, he argued when she refused. Living here, associating with a man you barely know. What would James say? James would want Sarah and me to be happy, Beth replied firmly. And Thomas makes us happy. The confrontation might have ended there if not for Harold Blackburn's temper. Finding Thomas at the sheriff's office, he accused him of taking advantage of a vulnerable widow. She's still in mourning, Harold spat, and you're moving in like a vulture. Thomas remained calm, though his eyes hardened. Mrs. Blackburn makes her own decisions. I suggest you respect them. Or what? Harold challenged, his hand hovering near his pistol. Sheriff Morgan intervened, ordering Harold to leave town or face arrest for disturbing the peace. The man departed, but not before warning that he would return with legal papers to claim guardianship of Sarah. Can he do that? Beth asked fearfully when Thomas told her what had happened. No, Thomas assured her. Not as long as you're her mother and of sound mind, but he might cause trouble. The threat cemented Thomas's decision. That evening, as they walked along the creek that had nearly prevented their meeting, he stopped beneath a cottonwood tree. I'm not good with fancy words, he began awkwardly. But I know what I want now, and it's you and Sarah, if you'll have me. Beth's eyes widened. Thomas, are you proposing? He nodded, producing a simple gold band. It was my mother's. I've carried it all these years, never thinking I'd have cause to use it again. Tears spilled down Beth's cheeks as she extended her trembling hand. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church in Dalhart. Sarah served as flower girl, beaming with pride as she walked down the aisle ahead of her mother. The entire town turned out for the celebration, many still referring to their meeting as the miracle of the storm. Pastor Wilkins spoke eloquently about second chances and God's mysterious ways. "Sometimes," he said, looking directly at Thomas and Beth, "the darkest storms bring the greatest blessings." Thomas found himself strangely moved by the ceremony. As he repeated his vows, memories of Emma flickered through his mind, not with the usual pain, but with a gentle acknowledgement. He would always carry her in his heart, but now that heart had expanded to hold new love. The newlyweds moved into a small house at the edge of town, with a view of the prairie Thomas had come to love. Sarah thrived, starting school in the fall and proudly telling anyone who would listen that her new father was the bravest deputy in Texas. Harold Blackburn returned as threatened, with papers from a judge in Amarillo. But he found himself facing not just Thomas and Beth, but the united front of the entire town. Sheriff Morgan, Dr. Wallace, Pastor Wilkins, and dozens of citizens testified to the stable and loving home Beth and Thomas provided. Even the circuit judge, impressed by the community's support and Thomas's standing as deputy sheriff, dismissed Harold's petition. "You've made quite an impression on this town," the judge told Thomas privately after the hearing. "Not many men would have ridden out in that storm." Thomas shook his head. "Anyone would have done it." "No," the judge replied. "That's where you're wrong, son. It's the exceptional man who rides into the storm when others seek shelter." As their first anniversary approached, Beth shared news that completed their family's journey. She was expecting a child. Thomas, overwhelmed with emotion, lifted her in his arms and spun her around their small kitchen, while Sarah danced around them in excitement. "Boy or girl doesn't matter," he declared. "This child will know nothing but love." That night, as Beth slept beside him, Thomas gazed out their bedroom window at the star-filled Texas sky. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted him as they once had. Emma and William would always be part of him, but he had learned that love was not a finite resource. His heart had room for the family he had lost and the one he had found. In late winter, as another storm raged outside, Thomas paced the floor of their bedroom while Dr. Wallace attended Beth in childbirth. Sarah sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Jenkins, making paper chains for the baby's welcome. "You can come in now," the doctor called after what seemed an eternity. Thomas entered to find Beth propped up in bed, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. In her arms lay a tiny bundle. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Thomas approached with reverence, gently taking the infant in his arms. The boy had a thatch of dark hair like his father and his mother's bright blue eyes. "Hello, little one," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I thought we might name him William," Beth suggested tentatively. "After your first son, is that all right?" Thomas couldn't speak for a moment, overcome by the gesture. "It's perfect," he finally managed. "William James Zimmerman." Sarah was brought in to meet her brother, climbing carefully onto the bed beside her mother. "He's so tiny," she marveled. "Was I that small?" "Even smaller," Beth assured her, drawing her close with one arm. Thomas sat beside them, his family complete in a way he had never dared to hope for. Outside, the storm that had raged all day began to subside, much like the storm of grief that had finally released its hold on his heart. 5 years later, the Zimmerman family had grown with the addition of twin girls, Emma and Rose. Thomas had been elected sheriff after Morgan retired, and Beth ran a small school from their home, which they had expanded to accommodate their growing family. The story of their meeting had become something of a legend in Dalhart and the surrounding area. The miracle of the storm, people still called it, especially when rain clouds gathered over the prairie. Children in town would ask Thomas to tell them about riding through the downpour to save Beth and Sarah. It wasn't that dramatic, he would insist, though his eyes always sought Beth's when he said it, both of them knowing how close they had come to never finding each other. On the 5th anniversary of that fateful night, Thomas took Beth back to the old line shack where they had sheltered from the storm. He had maintained it over the years, keeping it as a private retreat. Mrs. Jenkins had the children for the night, giving them a rare evening alone. "Do you ever think about how many things had to align perfectly for us to meet?" Beth asked as they sat on the porch, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. "If the storm hadn't come, if you hadn't been in the saloon when the stagecoach driver arrived, if Sarah hadn't been ill." Thomas took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there years ago. "I used to think life was just a series of random events," he admitted, "but now I'm not so sure." "The town called it a miracle," Beth reminded him, leaning against his shoulder. "Maybe they were right." Thomas smiled, drawing her close as the first drops of rain began to fall. "Maybe they were," he agreed. "Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe sometimes love is just strong enough to guide us through the storm." As the rain intensified around their shelter, Thomas kissed his wife with the same wonder he had felt when he first found her in that crumbling cabin. From unlikely beginnings in the worst storm in years, they had built something enduring and beautiful, a love strong enough to heal old wounds and brave enough to weather whatever storms might come. In Dalhart, their story continued to be told, passed down through generations, the tale of the cowboy who rode through rain to save a mother and child, and found his own salvation in the process. But for Thomas and Beth, the true miracle wasn't the dramatic rescue or the unlikely meeting. It was in the quiet moments of their shared life, in the laughter of their children, and in the love that had transformed two broken hearts into one complete family. As they rode back to town the next morning, the Texas landscape washed clean by the night's rain, wildflowers already pushing up through the mud, Thomas felt a contentment he had never thought possible. The wandering cowboy had finally found his home, not in a place, but in the hearts of the woman and children who rode beside him. And in that, perhaps, lay the greatest miracle of all.